Investigative Report long form, and one for Best Research. And so we are still riding high on that. Marcela Gaviria, producer, director of Firestone and the Warlord, is an award-winning journalist who has covered the rise of Al-Qaeda, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the use of psychiatric medications to treat children with behavioral problems, and the culture of risk-taking on Wall Street. She began her career as a fixer, a local on-the-scene reporter that helps others who come in, on Frontline's 1994 documentary about Pablo Escobar, the godfather of cocaine. In 1999, she returned to Frontline to work on the four-part series Drug Wars. I actually hired Marcela to work on that. She went on to produce over 30 hours for Frontline and is still at it, earning every major broadcast journalism award, including 8 Emmys. And I said that just this week she won the Best Investigative Documentary and Best Research for Firestone and the Warlord. And this summer, Firestone and the Warlord also won the prestigious Robert F. Kennedy Award and the Investigative Editors and Reporters Award. Jonathan Jones, reporter, has worked in journalism since 1999. And he started his career as a daily news reporter in Westchester, Pennsylvania. In 2007 and 2008, he and his wife, Anna Sussman, who is here, started Backpack Journalist. It's not what you think it sounds like. An independent reporting project focusing on human rights issues in East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. It was during that time that Jonathan began to focus on issues pertaining to business and human rights and learned of Firestone's operations in Liberia. And he'll have a lot more to say about his experiences there. After returning from Africa, Jonathan has worked as an investigative reporter on multiple projects for PBS Frontline and ProPublica, the independent reporting organization. Jonathan Jones has won the OPC Foundation's I.F. Stone Scholarship for an essay he wrote examining how the American company Firestone managed to continue operating in Liberia during the country's brutal civil war. And tonight he will talk about how his reporting led to the making of this film, Firestone and the Warlord. But before we turn the microphones over to Marcela and Jonathan, let's run just a 1-minute clip. To introduce the film.
A vicious civil war. Whoever was going to run Liberia needed Firestone.
I can't apologize for war. Everybody has had a war.
The untold story of what happened in Liberia 25 years ago.
They were prepared to do Taylor's bidding.
Firestone, they did not pay off warlords or give money on the table, didn't do any of those things. They did the right thing.
Frontline and ProPublica investigate the deal.
I have not seen this, and it's kind of amazing.
In looking at these conflicts, it's always good to follow the money.
Tonight, Firestone and the Warlord.
Are we all awake?
If you weren't awake, you are now.
Sorry
That
about
was a good blast.
That was,
That's quite all right. We'll get all this together.
I'll take the,
Let's begin, Jonathan, with you talking a little bit about the origins of the project.
Sure. Thank you all for coming. It's great that you're here. I just want to pull up a little bit and tell you a little bit about sort of how this project came together, and then we'll watch some clips. Basically, I was working in East Africa, and I'm going to show you a timeline that I actually first became interested in Firestone in June of 2007. And you'll see that it was a long time in coming till we actually got together with ProPublica and PBS Frontline to make the film. And in between along the way, I took a lot of other jobs to pay the bills. And I'm only showing you the timeline so you get a sense that, you know, for anyone who sort of has a project that they feel passionate about, that it can take a long time, but it's worth pursuing, because once in a while you do eventually see it on the screen. So just next slide. The idea came when I was actually reading 2 books and trying to brush up on history of Africa, and there were 2 lines that just referenced Firestone in Liberia, and they were just sort of throwaway lines in the book, but I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know anything about Firestone in Liberia, and I began looking for sort of the book of Firestone in Liberia. When I couldn't find it, I decided to try to write my own book. The next thing I did was I found some mentors who sort of helped me shape the scope of what I was looking into, and Adam Hochschild, who had written King Leopold's Ghost about rubber in the Congo, he served as a great mentor to me in the early stages and wrote me a letter of support, which eventually helped me to get some support and funding for it. And so these are the different funding and support that I applied for. I got a fellowship from the Investigative Reporting Program at UC Berkeley to do a year fellowship in looking into Firestone. And then also, of course, the Overseas Press Club. And these are just sort of some of the places that helped me sort of continue my research over the years. And of course, this was the reason I'm here is because I did get the Harper's Magazine Scholarship in memory of I.F. Stone. And it was one of the few places sort of online before the project aired that sort of talked about some of the scope of my work. And at that time, my idea was I was going to do a comprehensive history in 87 years of the operation in Liberia and tell that entire story. Of course, that's not what it ended up being. And one of the first things I did early on was I made a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and I filed it in February of 2009. And basically, with sort of the help of some State Department FOIA agents, crafted it to sort of say this, looking at for anything relating to combat in and around the plantation, human rights violations, and humanitarian relief. And then we received the cables in 2010, and what this allowed me to do was to piece together sort of a chronology. And what I found that at that time was I began to understand a little bit more about the Civil War that it began in 1989 in Liberia, and how the rebels had taken over the plantation and how they had kicked out the expatriates who worked for the company. And that sort of began my interest in looking at these key years at the beginning of the Civil War. And these are some of the other resources that I went to. I went anywhere that I could thought that I'd be able to find anything on Firestone in Liberia. And so these are just some of the places that sort of helped me fill in the details. And then in March of 2009, I made my first trip to Liberia, and I was there for about 3 weeks. And one of the first things I did was make contact with the Firestone Union, which allowed me access to the plantation, and they also let me interview them at length. And it was during that time that I really began to understand a little bit more about Firestone and what had happened on this rubber plantation during the Liberian Civil War. One of the things that I came back with, one of the lessons I learned from that trip was that it was going to be very hard to work within the consent on the rubber plantation. I didn't want to put people's jobs at risk, so one of the things that I ended up doing was to find Firestone employees or former Firestone employees who lived in the surrounding communities. And you could go to any community in Liberia and find someone who had worked or knew someone who had worked on the rubber plantation. So that was a workaround. And then I moved back in 2010 for about 9 months to Buchanan, Liberia, which is about 3 hours south of the capital, Monrovia. And it was during this time that I met Abel Welwian, who was who became my fixer and my good friend and researcher. And he he was so invaluable to me in that he was able to make introductions to tribal chiefs. He had been born on the plantation. He could provide some context as to what had happened. He had been there during the Civil War. And he also helped us to continue to report the story after I left for Liberia and returned to the United States. And then the other thing that I did was I conducted about 100 oral history interviews. And basically what that allowed me to do was take these historical events that I was interested in and then do sort of these sort of extensive interviews with people and get their experiences and their point of view on sort of how they saw things. And it allowed me to sort of collaborate and corroborate some of the experiences and the pivotal moments that occurred during the Civil War. The other thing that I did is I contacted some of the key players, including John T. Richardson, who was Charles Taylor's aide and chief negotiator, and I just met him on the street. He was drinking a Heineken outside of his garage, and I talked to him for about 2 hours. And then the other person that I also met was Amos Sawyer, who was the interim president during the war. And he was very critical of Firestone at the time, and when I met him, he was just as critical then, and it helped us when we were trying to figure out who to do interviews with when we went back last year. And then this was really the key moment for me in getting this project sold. I stumbled upon an insurance case in Akron, Ohio, in which Firestone, it involved Firestone trying to recoup losses for what had happened on the plantation during the Civil War. And in that, it was about 44 pounds of documents. There were a couple of key documents, including this one, which was the agreement between Firestone and then the rebel leader, Charles Taylor. It also had day-by-day entries from the general manager of the rubber plantation that really helped us to piece together sort of how the rebels had stormed and taken over the plantation. And so that led us to working with ProPublica and PBS Frontline, and I'm serious when I say, the way to make an award-winning documentary is to with award-winning filmmakers, because they were able to take sort of this massive amount of documentation and investigation and turn it into a compelling narrative. So I'm indebted to them for being able to do that.
Thanks, and I'm indebted to you for your enormous amounts of work. I mean, it was pretty much 6 years of research before it landed on my lap. And when Rainey Aronson, the head of Frontline, said, "How about this story?" And I read Jonathan's treatment and I was just sort of riveted. I don't think you had quite found the focus, but it was incredible to me that it was literally the story about a group of executives from Akron, Ohio, stuck in a rubber plantation in Africa in the middle of a civil war, with an army of child soldiers, a lunatic called Charles Taylor, and of course you've got the makings of a brilliant narrative. The question I had a little bit is like, why now? Why make a film now about something that happened 25 years ago? And I actually really struggled with that question, because I feel like you could pick on many corporations that are stuck in, Africa or Malaysia or Latin America doing pretty awful things. And then I thought about it a bit harder, and I said, no, this is something that stands the test of time. This is a story that that's really a parable about business and war. And so then the question was, how do you make a film with 40 pounds of documents? Like, you don't have any characters, you haven't convinced anybody to go on camera, you're not sure you're going to get access to the plantation, you don't know what executive's going to talk to you. And we worked really hard. It's on. And we worked really, everyone can hear me? Yeah. And so our original kind of task was how to bring these documents to life. But I guess the first clip I wanted to share with you was we hadn't gotten access to the plantation at that point, but I really wanted to set up the dramatic tension between all these executives that are having a wonderful life on their plantation, living amongst workers that are perhaps more unhappy in the middle of the Civil War that's going to come crashing into their plantation. So the first clip, which hopefully will not render me dead for the next 20 years, and we will play it in a sec. Do you think we've got the volume at the right? Or is
I'll start low.
Yeah. Okay.
Give me just a moment.
So this is basically before the Civil War has broken out. We managed to obtain only all these people, 100 folks that we interviewed, only one really had good pictures. And convincing him to give us the pictures was quite a challenge, but we got it.
For the expats, life on the plantation was enjoyable.
We actually had a 9-hole golf course. The greens were oiled sand. Certainly during the rainy season, the fairways were nicer than they were in the dry season. You would have at least the length of your club to find some grass in which evolved. But it was nice.
We would stay at each other's houses so that all golf teams didn't have anything to worry about. Clubs would be open for the evening for the ones that really liked to party. And there also was a fishing club there that nearly everybody had a boat for. And we'd go deep sea fishing, have fishing tournaments, etc. You'd have a boat boy took care of your boat and all that good stuff. And it was fantastic because off the west coast of Africa, some of the best fishing in the world. Wahoo, marlin, tuna, sailfish, everything is there. It's fantastic.
For Taylor, it also had the makings of a perfect base. The plantation center was in Harbell, named after the company's founder, Harvey Firestone, and his wife, Ida Bell. It was strategically located, only 45 minutes away from the capital, Monrovia, and right next to a key regional airport, Roberts International.
They were just such tempting targets. They had everything that a rebel army would want. They had fuel supplies, they had generators, they had communications, they had food. And they had nice facilities. They had clinics and they had really nice houses. So it was a very, very good base to operate from.
I would say whoever was going to run Liberia needed Firestone. And I think Taylor felt that he was going to be that man. So yes, he needed Firestone. Let's say we were very influential on what happened in the country and what went on in the country.
All right. Marty, you want to have a question for us, or anybody in the audience want to ask something?
I'll go to the audience first, or I can throw out a question.
I think what's striking is, I mean, Jonathan's presentation was terrific and fascinating. No, I hadn't seen that before. And then to add to that all of the other sort of documentary research that Marcela did to bring it to life, it was just very vivid. I had a question for you, Jonathan, and that is when you first were looking at the documents from your FOIA request, how much did they change what was at that time the sort of received wisdom about the history of Liberia, the war, and Firestone? What surprises were there?
Well, so on Firestone's website at the time, they basically said that various factions had occupied the plantation at different times during the war. And then at the Lonely Planet, West Africa said that the plantation had been completely dormant during the war. And then these documents basically said a lot more than that. And they were really detailed, and they framed the debate. And so, for me, it was, the type of evidence that I could actually cite and back up these assertions, which I was already hearing from people that I was interviewing. So, I mean, for me, it was like the documents that I could really cite and say, hey, this is actually really what happened. It wasn't dormant at all during the war.
Right here.
What made you feel like this was like doing a film was the correct way or the right way to convey the story? Did you ever think about any other?
Yeah, so I was going to write a book about
Yeah.
the history of Firestone,
Yeah.
and I tried to write a book about the history of Firestone, and I had given up that project, and so it actually, I guess when I had the timeline up there and I began working for Frontline and for ProPublica on other projects, that sort of gave me both an appreciation for what you can do in film, and then also access to great filmmakers and people I could pitch to. So that's sort of how it came together.
The interesting thing about the sort of trove of documents for me was that there really was only, in 44 pounds of paper, only like 3 smoking guns. But there was a lot of detail about what happened, when it happened, what people were feeling, how they were sort of dealing with the army of child soldiers. It had clues as to who to try to go find. So all of this sort of helped us piece kind of little narrative elements, as if you were going to tell a story and you need all these layers of sound and pictures and characters. The next thing that I wanted to do was sort of make a film that wasn't scanning all the documents, because I thought that would be really sort of like kind of like nightly news, you know, like shine a little light on the important lines. So I wanted to sort of bring to life those moments. So when he said he discovered the diary of the manager that was on the plantation just as the rebels were taking over the plantation, in a little studio in Denver, Colorado, the sound man pretended that he was making this diary, and this is what it looks like. So let's roll clip number 2. No, it would be 3, sorry.
Well, you're on 3 now, right?
Yes.
Good.
In his diary, Ansminger notes that 8 to 10 rebels burst into the golf club, demanding vehicles. Later on, they took fuel, bags of rice, handheld radios, and petty cash, including $40 to the rebel leader, Peter, a hothead and drunk. Ken Gerhardt was stationed down the road from the plantation at the Coca-Cola bottling plant, a property of Firestone. He was in constant communication with Ansminger.
We still had radio communications, he and I. And well, they were saying things were heating up because they were getting so many demands from Taylor's army. Money, food, whatever, you know. They wanted whatever they could get. And unfortunately, when they couldn't get it, they would go out in the villages and take what they wanted. So things were really heating up.
We knew we were going to be out for trouble. They went to your house if you had a private vehicle, or even Firestone vehicle back in your yard, they would take the vehicle, take valuables. I mean, they said that they were at war with Mandingos and Crowns. So they were looking for Mandingos and Crowns, and as they identified them, they were killing them.
The U.S. Embassy had advised U.S. citizens to evacuate, but the managers stayed put. On June 7th, day 3, thousands of Firestone workers fled their homes.
So that was an attempt to kind of make that diary come to life. There's a few internal edits that we did for expediency tonight, but because we didn't really have access to everybody, like we went onto eBay and we bought the mug that said Firestone, and we found the pen that somebody was selling, the Firestone pen, and we found a diary that somebody had with notes on the plantation that was for sale. So we spent, you know, a couple $1,000s on eBay buying, you know, little memorabilia. And you know, as simple as that, trying to kind of give the scene a bit of authenticity. We also worked really hard on getting an interview with Ansminger, the head of the plantation, who was still alive. And I had a long conversation with him. He really didn't want to talk to us at first. And just about a week before air date, he changed his mind. And he said, okay, I'm gonna go on the record. And I had already like blocked the film, and I was like, you know, I'm gonna have to, what if it contradicts what we've reported? What, you know, how am I going to deal with all of this? And it actually just corroborated everything we had. And in fact, it made it more damning. And it was pretty shocking that, you know, the way the narrative unfolds, you really come to understand that he was actually the moral conscience in some ways, and he was really furious at headquarters for the way they were handling things.
So you did, Jonathan, you did a lot of primary source interviews before Marcela came on board. Some of those were also Firestone executives?
Yeah, so I'd spoken to the, not Ensminger, but the general manager who had been there after Ensminger had left the plantation. And then, but I'd also spoken to many senior Liberian managers who were who had still been on the plantation after the expats had evacuated. And I think for me, one of the more pivotal moments in doing those primary source interviews was I was talking to one of the senior Liberians who he had been sent to Akron to school, and he had kind of risen up the ranks at the plantation. And at the end of the interview, you know, when you're kind of done and you're wrapping up, and he said, I want to tell you one last thing. When they packed up and they left in 1990, he's like, that left a bitter taste in my mouth. And he like, and it, you know, it's one of those key moments. And I had no clue that that was a pivotal moment until you see the emotion in those people, you know, and then you could go back to the State Department and find this sort of day by day things.
It's remarkable to me that many of them, after those primary source interviews, when you've had to ask them, you know, all the expository questions, but also hard questions about what they were doing. Was it surprising then that they continued to want to participate in the project and come on board and do on-camera interviews?
Well, we really struggled because a lot of them are long, lifetime Firestone employees. They get their pension from Firestone. And a lot of them would say, I can't talk to you because, you know, if you do an expose or something, my pension will be cut. And I couldn't quite guarantee them that that wouldn't happen, although it certainly sounded illegal to me. I mean, if you've worked all your life, you're still allowed to have an opinion and say what you want. They hadn't necessarily, some of the top...
If you cut deals with warlords, I don't think cutting people's pensions is really a big problem.
So some of the top management had signed non-disclosure agreements, but some of the middle management hadn't. But we really had a very hard time getting people to speak to us. And I think in the end, we managed to get maybe 5 employees that were there, and they were really key in our narrative. So
you mentioned non-disclosure agreements, and that's a really interesting question, because I would guess that today, a lot of companies, I mean, it's a much more common practice to get your employees to sign non-disclosure agreements that you're not going to talk after you leave the company than it was in the 50s or 60s or 70s. I wonder if you'd be able to get as much access if it wasn't a story rooted in the early 90s.
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that helped us, at least for the people that spoke to us on camera and then those that spoke to us off camera, is that they did really love their experience in Liberia. Other than the war occurring, you could kind of it was kind of like, let's look at the old photo album and how crazy was it that these rebels stormed and we had to leave. And so I think that there was a little bit of nostalgia that really did open the door a little bit for us.
I think the next clip we'll show is actually after they've been kicked out of the plantation because there's a civil war. The plantation's been overtaken by all the rebels. And they are freaking out in Akron, Ohio, because this is a really important plantation for their business. And they're trying to figure out how to get back in.
In the late 80s, 40% of the latex used in America came from Firestone's plantation in Liberia. In the industry, Firestone's product was considered some of the highest quality latex in the world. At company headquarters, top managers were under pressure to get the Liberia operation back up and running.
when you can't produce latex, can't produce block rubber, can't get it sent out to the end users, I would assume we were losing lots of money.
It was a big deal because it was their own source of rubber for the tires. And it was the largest plantation in the world, and they had a market established over many, many years, so it was very important to them.
Firestone had been bought by the Japanese conglomerate Bridgestone in 1988, and the corporation had been losing money. Executives in Akron began to plot their return.
Firestone's intent was to make money. Always has and always will. We're in the business to make money. So if it's not making money, let's make it so it does. Why did we go back? Because we felt sorry for the people that were there? Probably not. We wanted to get the investment earning money again.
One of the first things management did was hire a Liberian attorney based in the U.S.
The meetings actually took place in Akron in 1990 at the old big Firestone headquarters, a big building there in Akron. The discussions focused on what to do next. Would you have to deal with Charles Taylor? Could you do that? There was tremendous worry about the safety of their employees, most particularly the 8, 9, 10,000 Liberians that they employed. So how can we help these people? What do we do next? So it was a real dilemma for the company, and a lot of, I would say, soul searching and really tough decision making that had to be done.
That was an interview that also came in very late in the production process. It was really interesting because the first thing I did when I came on board was write a letter to Firestone saying, we're about to make a film about you. Will you participate? And we started in this very intense negotiation where they wanted us to, they met a crisis. I feel like it's working. No? Okay, sorry. They hired a crisis communication firm. They had multiple meetings with us in person in a boardroom. It was T. Miller from ProPublica and myself staring down 8 men in suits that, and we had a very hard time convincing them to give us access. And lo and behold, they thought about it hard and they said, we want you to see our operation. We're going to invite you to Liberia and you're going to see everything. We want to be upfront. And we were getting ready to fly to, we were there and they said, but you can only do this in September. And I was sort of arguing with them that that wouldn't work with my production timetable. But all along, this is happening. The Ebola outbreak is ramping up. And pretty much the week that we were supposed to land on the plantation, Firestone headquarters decided that with all the outbreak, they couldn't have a crew filming something about Charles Taylor in the 1980s on their plantation. And so they said, come back in a year. And we were like, well, we may not be making this film then. So we had to proceed making a film with scraps of footage. And one of their absolute, like, do not step on the plantation rules. So that was always hard to work around. We ended up filming in rubber plantations nearby. You know, we did all sorts of things.
I just wanted to say, I was thinking about this when we were talking about getting people to talk on camera. I mean, this is stating the obvious, but it's much easier when you're working with PBS Frontline and you can show some of the work that you've done and you have a reputation for being fair and for being balanced and for taking the complexities. And I think, you know, you can't put a price on that. And I really do think that, you know, I mean, people did talk to me, but I think more because I knew so much about the history, but people really, I think it was PBS Frontline's reputation and Marcela's reputation as a filmmaker that really helped to convince some of the people to go on camera.
I imagine it's also that you say to them, look, the film is going to be about you in any case. And so you can choose to watch it with you, having a voice in it, or you know, or not.
And you can tell that Martin Smith mentored me because I use those exact words.
I think everybody does in journalism. There's a question right here.
I have a quick question. Was that the first time then that you contacted Firestone to let them know that, you know, through this whole timeline, was that the first time that you contacted them?
So I had actually flown out to Indianapolis when I first started the project, and then had done a company tour on the plantation with the company in 2009. And then when we started, you contacted them pretty early on.
But in 2009, they had no idea that there was a Frontline coming.
They were very nervous. And I had a great relationship with the head of communications there. You'll notice that we do have drone footage flying over the original building. You know, they allowed us to film. It wasn't like we did this surreptitiously. We had permission.
Well, I think the obvious next question is, what kind of direct reaction did you get from Firestone after the program aired?
Yeah. Silence.
To this day.
Well, a little. I see it a little bit differently. If you look, one of the PowerPoint presentations which I had up there, but I've taken it down. But they're old. Liberians have been asking for Firestone to come forward with answers basically since 1993, and as I had said on their website before, that they had said basically that various warring factions had occupied the plantation. After the film, or probably the day of the film, they redid it and they explained exactly sort of their perspective and why they made the decisions that they made. And I mean, Gerald Padmore, who was the Liberian attorney you saw there, he really did provide a perspective into how they were seeing things from Akron. And so I feel like one of the ways that we had an impact is they did have to come forward and kind of tell their side of the story, which is what Liberians have been asking for.
Well, they answered our questions and they sent a written response, and that's on Frontline's website if you're curious to read the whole thing. It's pretty interesting. But I didn't actually get a pat on the back like great looking film.
That would be disturbing, actually. I wanted to, before you show the next clip, just mention that the Frontline has a pretty deep dive website that accompanies all of its programs, and this one in particular, and talk a little bit about the print piece that went with it, and your own reaction, Jonathan, as a print reporter. Did you feel that the documentary, I mean, I imagine you felt the documentary gave things that you couldn't get in print, but also you must have had some frustrations that you couldn't get down every note, and you know.
My wife will tell you that surprisingly, I didn't have that reaction when I saw that even the first rough cut. I mean, obviously you can't fit everything in there. We did a 20,000 word print piece, which you can read in ProPublica, that T. Miller and I co-wrote. And so that gets into really some of the nitty gritty and some of the people that we spoke to who didn't go on camera. So there's a lot more details in the print piece. But I felt, you know, I think one of the rewarding aspects for me was to hear from both the Liberians and the Americans who had been there, and who had been there at the time, that had sort of said, yeah, that was pretty much the way it had gone down. And so I felt like we hadn't overstated things, and that to me was very rewarding to hear from people like Ken Gerhardt and some other folks that, yeah, that's sort of how it happened.
All the former employees that participated were very pleased, with the exception of one person who just, I think he was surprised because he never thought anything went wrong at the plantation. So he sort of hadn't quite come to grips with our way of retelling that story, and it upset him.
You had another clip.
We're going to show you one which is clip 5, and they're trying their damnedest to get back on the plantation, and they've got to do some letter writing to Charles Taylor.
Much of what we know from the era comes from corporate records that until now were buried in a long-forgotten court file, and hundreds of State Department cables obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. One of the earliest documents we found was a letter signed by Donald Ensminger on October 3rd, 1990. It's addressed to Commander-in-Chief Charles Taylor, requesting a meeting. The second one, sent a week later. All sides need to recognize that Firestone continues to incur major losses as a result of hostilities. Then, 3 months later, one of Taylor's aides sent a letter back to Akron. President Taylor has directed us to inform you that your team should come to Harbel to make the necessary assessment of the plantation. A few weeks later, a small group of Firestone managers headed back to Monrovia.
We were each given a survival kit. That's your responsibility. The mission is to go back and start the plantation, start up the plantation.
The managers had been away from Liberia for 8 months. They were shocked by the country they found.
It's a disaster completely. I saw very few dogs left, everything been eaten. All the palm trees have been cut down for the cabbage on top because everybody was starving to death. No cats. And if you saw a rat, he was big because he'd been well fed. On the streets, when I started driving around, you would be driving over human bones on the streets. You couldn't miss them.
The managers found it hard to get to the plantation. Taylor was making life difficult for them.
Rebels were on the plantation and up to the suburbs of Monrovia. The higher management was talking about getting back onto the plantation, but I think we realized that someone didn't want us to go back to the plantation.
Can I ask a point of clarification in there?
Yeah.
And that you mentioned that a letter was written to President Taylor, but at that time, what was he?
He wasn't the president of Liberia, but those were the clues that they were. He wanted to be called president. He was the president of Banga, which he self-proclaimed president of Banga. So the fact that Firestone was already referring to him as president was a clue. When Jonathan handed me all the documents, one of the things that I had fun doing actually was matching the font of the letters to the exact typewriter and going to a company that rents typewriters and identifying the exact typewriter and the exact typewriter for Charles Taylor's computer, typewriter. And then, making it sort of dueling typewriters. But it was interesting because I showed this clip and I think it was your bosses at ProPublica said, how did you know it was a woman typing the letter? And I said, it was the 1980s. and then they're like, I don't know. You got to make sure. So we actually called up the executives and said, who was writing those letters? Oh, and it was, Bess or Molly. Do you think she had, we never checked if the nail polish was red.
The nail polish was great.
It was artistic.
It's Firestone red, of course.
And just to follow up on what you were saying about President Taylor, one of the early letters said Commander-in-Chief Charles Taylor, and then you see the documents change, and then they start to call him president before he's actually president, of course, of Liberia. And so you realize that that's one of those small little things where they go from saying Commander-in-Chief, we just want to get back, and it's all business, and then it's President Charles Taylor, have a great Christmas. We wish you the best of luck in Liberia, and they sort of a little more fawning than they were in the early letters.
It is truly a film that's based on that correspondence, being able to sort of piece how difficult and contentious that relationship was over time and how he'd softened depending on what manager was at the plantation and how they got along. I don't know how much time we have. You guys might have more questions, but I could show one more clip or two or none or.
I get some nodding out there when you say clip.
Patricia?
Oh, yeah.
Two. Well, one of the things that this film does is not just tell the story of Firestone, but tell the story of the Liberian Civil War. And we didn't want to just make a film about executives. It was an important opportunity to be able to talk about the genocide that happened there and in Western Africa. So this is something that hopefully gives a bit more context.
As Taylor's ambition for money and territory grew, he expanded his reach to neighboring Sierra Leone. He recruited thousands of new fighters, many of them children. For his own presidential guard, Taylor created a special division of young boys.
They were formerly called the Small Boys Unit. They were very young boys, very often orphans, that somehow became like his sons, and they would do anything for him. And they manned these roadblocks across the country, wherever the front lines were. They adopted horrifying names like General Quick, Dead Body Bones. Got to the point where they would bet, if a pregnant woman was walking towards the roadblock, they bet on what sex the fetus was. And they would open her up with a bayonet to see. And they would just dump the bodies right there.
Mr. Taylor seemed quite proud of his SBU, Small Boy Unit. All of them were the Taylor shock troops. There was also a lot of drugs that were circulating and probably administered or encouraged by the MPFL. So it was a pretty, in some ways, disorganized, crazy, but also terrifying kind of a phenomenon to be rushed by a lot of folks pretty much out of their heads.
During this war, we picked these kids up in villages, in towns, on the highway. Just there, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids. You put them in the pickup, you take them home. You feed them, you give them a bath, you tell them, okay, you are my SBU. Everybody wanted to be a soldier. This war was ugly. I saw skulls. I saw dogs eating bodies. I saw bloated bodies. I saw exploding bodies. I saw women dead. I saw children dead. I saw babies dead. I saw war. I can't apologize for war. Everybody has had a war.
I don't know what to say about that.
How did he feel about the film?
He hasn't reached out. I sent him a copy. You know, I think I do want to look him up though. He was a very interesting person to interview because he really has no regrets about what happened, and he makes no apologies or excuses. So
there was another episode about the killing of 4 American nuns.
not in that show.
Not in the program, but it was stuff that you reported out and had the material. Again, the film itself is available at Frontline's website, frontline.org. And you just have to find the search box and put in Firestone and the Warlord. And there is a link to the ProPublica long article, beautifully done article. But there's also another film, a small film about the killing of the nuns. Do I have that right? It's 4 American nuns. So in these projects, you know, Jonathan collected an enormous amount of material, and there was an enormous range of stuff. But through the use of the digital media and the website, a lot of this stuff gets published. Where in the past, it would go into a box and be thrown away. So there's a lot more there on the website if you're interested, and of course, as I said, you can watch the whole film.
And we do have more clips, but I know, you know, people have places to go. Do you guys have any questions, or?
Was the advisor to Charles Taylor, is he the one that you met initially in sort of garage?
Right.
Okay.
And I'd done an oral history interview, which basically, I started up, so tell me where you were born. And he said, what does this have to do with Firestone? And I said, well, you know, I'm doing these long oral histories. But it was sort of a way into how he had become, how he had first joined Charles Taylor's forces. And he told the story about driving up to the general manager's house to meet Charles Taylor because he wanted to join up and he wanted to join Charles Taylor's forces.
I guess this is sort of, I just have one follow-up question, kind of. What, I guess there have been, this is a different style of documentary, but I guess like the act of killing is like the famous example of the recent film where you're kind of focusing on the people who have committed these crimes and the way that they talk about them. And I was just interested in your decision to use focus on him a little bit, but also show the images of the things that he was describing. And was that kind of that editorial decision, was that sort of like, obviously we're going to show these pictures because they're horrifying things, and it would be a different film if we were focusing on it. And I guess I'm just interested in the decision to illustrate with those images as opposed to.
Well, I don't believe in sanitizing war. You know, I think if you're going to watch a film like this and you're going to start thinking that this is the man that Firestone made a deal with, and these were the things that they were doing, and the executives on the plantation were seeing deaths on the plantation, that the question was, how did you as an individual deal with all these atrocities going on? And how did you justify it in your mind to stay in Liberia and continue working? Because people had choices. They could have left, and some people did. And so.
I also think, just from a storytelling point, I'm thinking more along the print story at this point, was, you know, one of the most important points we wanted to make was that, you know, people knew early on what Charles Taylor and his rebel forces were doing. And it wasn't, you know, Charles Taylor became president, and then, you know, he was in power until 2003. I mean, but it wasn't as if they didn't know back in 1990 or 1991 what was going on and the ethnic killings and that sort of thing. And so I think you know, this was Africa in the 1990s, and while we know a lot about Rwanda and perhaps some other things, the Liberian War is kind of off the radar. So I think that was part of the decision to sort of tell people about the atrocities.
One of the things I found so stunning about this film was just the fact that this history was suppressed for so long. And it made me wonder, you know, there are many war zones across the world, but today, did you ever, during the course of reporting this, or even just in the response you got, find parallels, potential things, times in which history like this has been repeated or could be, and we have no idea? Is there the possibility that something like this is happening now, and is that something you've encountered?
We met with certain lawyers that were working on different cases. Nothing was quite as shocking, you know. It was sort of more. I can send you some leads that I got from that time, but yeah.
Sorry, no, it's just like it's.
No, you know, when you're making a film, it's just, you know, I'm a one-track mind, so.
There are certainly far-off corners of the earth, you know, where multinational corporations are operating and there's human rights violations going on. And I think looking at the business relationships between multinational corporations and the military, it's an interesting area of investigation.
But is it inevitable? So even this, like, it was still, you know, 2 decades later and longer, so difficult to get people to talk, right? Is it just the case that you would need, you know, decades after something like this in order for it to be palatable to the public, like B, to be able to FOIA those documents? I assume, like 1995, like that's not something you could have necessarily done at the time. They've been so available at the time, I'm not sure.
Can you only tell a story like this decades later?
I don't think so. I think you can do it nowadays. It might have other challenges, but I still think it's possible. Go get it, Masma.
I also had a question regarding time. Since this all happened 20 years ago, did you run into any problems with characters misremembering events, changing narratives, stories not lining up, or just not corresponding with the documents you had?
Remember the amount of people that had died? That was one of the biggest problems. We'd find somebody and we'd call up and it'd be like, no, they died 1 month ago. You know, it was sort of, all these people were really old. But I felt like people's memories were pretty intact. They hadn't spoken about it, which was odd. A lot of people felt like they had repressed what had happened, and sometimes would be letting things out for the first time after a long time. And it was very interesting to see how much they had held in for so long.
I do think that that's where, having done the preliminary research, we were able to sort of corroborate things, you know, in a way that perhaps wouldn't have been possible. So we had the State Department cables and these other pre-interviews, and then we go back and are they being consistent? So there were some they were remarkably consistent.
I have one minor question. But with your FOIA request, was the Vinsinger, or whatever his name was, the manager's diary, that was, where did you get
No, that came from the insurance case where they were trying to recoup losses that were incurred, essentially.
And did you have trouble with the FOIA request? Did you get everything?
So I got no request. I got no response until the week after Obama came into office, and then I got a call from a FOIA officer.
How long have you been trying?
I can't remember when I first FOIA'd, but the first conversation I had was in, you know, January of 2009. And he said, "Oh, I've had your FOIA request on my desk, and now I can talk to you about it." And he said, let's craft this in a way in which you'll be able to get the documents that you need. And it was the way that he spoke that made me think there's a story here.
Yeah.
And he was really invaluable. You know, you need those people on the inside that sort of can recognize, you know, what you're looking for and aren't threatened by you asking for public documents.
We have time for one more clip? Yes? No?
Oh,
okay.
Well, we're gonna go for clip number 9. I'm not sure if it begins with Charles Taylor, but I believe it does. I'm hoping it does, where he...
Clip 9.
He talks in The Hague. He's you know, been tried for genocide and crimes against humanity, and this is the conclusion.
Oh my, yeah. It is spun down.
I think we're rebooting here.
Yeah.
So then the clips of the violence, the genocide, where did those come from?
Nessa Azimi, who was our archival researcher, had the task of really searching and scouring for every little bit of footage, because there was surprisingly not that much. I mean, Liberia had been a conflict that was covered at times, but it was sort of like 3 cameramen who had all the footage. And
It is, yeah.
there were a lot more photographs than footage.
Sorry, Chad,
I shut it down. It's okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that you had shut it down.
Okay.
Well, we're coming back to life here.
While we're waiting, one of the amazing finds that Nessa came across was a meeting that Firestone had in Bongo, which was upcountry where Charles Taylor had his base of operations. And from someone who had looked into the story to see this actual meeting happen. It was just one of those great archival finds, sort of helps us put the story together.
Oh, miracle. Miracle.
He knows my password. No?
Did you hit the arrow?
Should I get up? There you
There
go.
it is.
Wait,
From the cable.
That's not it, menu, last one.
Is it the last one?
Yeah.
Okay, we're in business.
All right, sorry about that. I'm sorry.
Firestone says it was powerless to prevent Taylor from occupying the plantation, and that at no time did the company have a collaborative relationship with him.
The accused has been found responsible for acts of terrorism, murder, rape, sexual slavery, cruel treatment, recruitment of child soldiers, enslavement, and pillage.
Taylor is currently serving a 50-year sentence at Franklin Prison in the north of England. As for Firestone, they resumed operations at the plantation in 1996. In the years since, the company has invested more than $146 million to improve the conditions on the plantation. The company remains the largest private employer in Liberia.
Do I think they have blood on their hands? Yes, I believe they facilitated a warlord in his insurrection and in the atrocities that he created. Sometimes people make decisions they regret. I don't know if Firestone regrets the decisions they made in Liberia during the insurrection. Might want to ask them that question.
Does Firestone regret any decisions that it made in Liberia during this insurrection?
Anyone who dealt with Liberia in the period from 1980 to 2003 must have regrets that what could I have done differently? Might I have prevented something? I think the decisions they made, in my opinion, were completely justifiable. And to be very frank, I believe they were the right decisions. Had they not taken those decisions, I think Liberia would be much the worse for it today.
Last month, Firestone and its parent company, Bridgestone, sent Frontline and ProPublica a response to our questions, saying, Firestone's decision to remain in Liberia was very costly for the company. Firestone was able to preserve an important economic asset for Liberia, and we are proud of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks all for coming. It was fun.
Hello, I'm Patricia Kranz, Executive Director of the OPC. I know some of you are students from Columbia and NYU in various places. So out there, we do have information, our newsletter, Dayline Magazine, which we put out every year at the awards dinner, and applications. And we have a website too, so please, please take some of the materials, consider joining. It's only $20 for students. And we are, as you can see, we videotape most of our programs, and we have a lot of interesting previous programs that you might find useful. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it.